You caught me at a good moment. Sit down. I was just about to pour something and talk myself out of it. The rain's been steady since 9, and the office smells like old paper and decisions I regret. You know that smell. You've been here before. Tonight I want to tell you about a case that didn't start in the rain. Started under the sun, if you can believe it. Sun like a punishment. That kind of trip. Pam had been after me for 2 weeks to take it. She left the file on my desk 3 times, and I moved it to the filing cabinet twice and once behind the radiator, which she found immediately because she finds everything. Pam is my secretary in the same way the ocean is wet, technically accurate, almost beside the point. She's sharper than most detectives I know, and considerably better dressed. She said, "Jack, it's the Caribbean. In February." I said I'd think about it. She booked the flight. The client was a man named Gerald Holt, import business. Legal on the surface, which in my experience means interesting underneath. He came in on a Thursday, 2-piece suit that cost more than my rent. The kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He explained the situation with the efficiency of a man accustomed to being listened to. A deal, a big one, an island, a partner who'd vanished before the ink could dry. The partner's name was Raymond Sorel, French Caribbean, based out of Martinique, with connections across 3 islands, and the kind of reputation that travels faster than the man himself. The deal they'd been negotiating was for a warehouse complex on St. Armel, a small island east of Guadeloupe that most maps don't bother labeling. The agreement was worth close to $2 million. The signing had been scheduled for a Tuesday noon waterfront hotel, broad daylight. Sorel never showed. Holt said there'd been no argument, no warning, no note. Sorel had simply ceased to be present the way objects sometimes do when you're absolutely certain you left them somewhere. The local authorities had taken a statement and done approximately nothing with it, which Holt found intolerable. His money was in escrow, his timeline was disrupted. And no one in St. Armel seemed particularly troubled by any of it. He wanted Raymond Sorel found. Preferably alive, he added. I appreciated the specification. I left on a Saturday. Pam came to see me off, which she claimed was to hand me the case documents, and which was also something else, neither of us said what. She told me to be careful in the way that sounds like instructions, but functions like concern. I told her I was always careful. She looked at me with the expression she reserves for statements she finds technically unverifiable. The plane was small, the seats were smaller, and somewhere over the gulf the clouds broke. And the water below turned a color I didn't have a name for. St. Armel was not on the main tourist route, which meant it had been spared certain improvements and retained certain textures. The dock smelled of salt, fish, and diesel. The streets were narrow, and the paint on most buildings was engaged in a slow, dignified retreat from the walls it had once covered. The heat was not a temperature, it was a presence. It had opinions. It made itself known immediately, and continued to do so for the entirety of my stay, with no apparent fatigue. My contact on the island was a man named Etienne Beaumont, who had been described to me as a fixer, and who fixed things the way some doctors practice medicine, broadly, confidently, and with a high tolerance for outcomes that weren't exactly what you'd asked for. He met me at the dock in a white linen shirt and a straw hat and the kind of smile that suggests deep familiarity with situations he was not technically involved in. He said he knew Raymond Sorel. Most people did, he explained. That was the problem. Etienne drove me through the town in a car that sounded like it was running on optimism and residual momentum. He talked while he drove, hands occasionally leaving the wheel to emphasize a point, which I found less reassuring than he seemed to. He told me Sorel was respected on the island, connected, the kind of man who knew which doors to knock on and which ones to walk through without knocking. His disappearance, Etienne said, was not the kind of thing that happened to a man like Sorel. Unless, of course, it was arranged. We passed the hotel where the signing had been scheduled. The Hotel du Port, 3 stories, colonial balconies, ceiling fans visible through the open shutters of the dining room. I asked Etienne to stop. I got out and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building the way you look at a place where something happened before you arrived. The sun was directly overhead. There were no shadows worth mentioning. I thought about that later. At the time, I just took off my jacket and went inside. The hotel manager was a man named Florent, small and careful, with the particular composure of someone who makes a living ensuring other people's problems remain invisible. He confirmed what Holt had told me. Sorel had reserved the meeting room. Had, in fact, confirmed the reservation by telephone the morning of. A bottle of mineral water and 2 glasses had been prepared. The glasses remained untouched. Sorel had not checked in, had not entered the lobby, had not been seen in or near the hotel before or after the scheduled noon. I asked whether anyone had seen anything unusual that morning. Florent considered the question with the gravity it deserved and said no. Then one of the kitchen staff, a young woman who had been pretending not to listen from behind a service cart, said something in Creole that Etienne translated with unusual carefulness. She had seen a white car parked across the street since before 8 in the morning. It was still there at 1. By 2, it was gone. No one she recognized behind the wheel. Tinted glass. Engine running. That was the kind of detail that changes a missing person case into something with harder edges. A parked car watching a hotel for 6 hours isn't curiosity, it's patience. And patience, in my experience, usually belongs to people who already know how something is going to end. I thanked Florent, thanked the kitchen worker, and walked back out into the heat, which received me without sympathy. I wrote 3 words in my notepad: watched, known, gone. None of them pointed somewhere comfortable. Etienne took me to Sorel's regular office next, a room above a shipping broker on Rue des Flamands' 2nd floor, windows facing the harbor. The door was unlocked, which is either an invitation or a warning, depending on who left it that way. Inside, everything was orderly. No sign of struggle, nothing obviously missing, though I couldn't know what should have been there. A desk, files, a wall map with certain ports circled in red pen. I noted which ones. Habit. Good habit, as it turned out. One of the circled ports was on the northeastern tip of the island, a place called Anse Marigoc, which Etienne told me was a working fishing dock that also, from time to time, worked at other things. The kind of dock that doesn't appear in business directories. I asked how far. He said 30 minutes by road, 45 by road if I drove it myself. He said this without malice. I took it in the spirit it was offered. We went together. The road wound up through the interior, through green so dense it felt intentional. That was when the first tension of the trip introduced itself. We were about 20 minutes out when a truck came up behind us fast, too fast for the road, and certainly too fast for its intentions to be accidental. Etienne noticed before I did, which raised my opinion of him considerably. He accelerated without comment. The truck matched. The road narrowed. There were no guardrails, and the drop on the right side of the road was substantial and unhurried. The truck moved to pass and instead leaned into our lane. Etienne handled it the way a man handles something he has handled before. He braked hard, let the truck overshoot, then turned onto a sidetrack that appeared in the vegetation without warning, as if it had been placed there for exactly this purpose. The truck kept going. We sat in the shade of the trees with the engine ticking, and the birds carrying on with their business, as if nothing had happened. Etienne adjusted his hat. I unclenched a hand I hadn't noticed clenching. We agreed not to discuss it and proceeded to Anse Marigon. The dock at Anse Marigon was smaller than I'd expected, and quieter than made sense for the middle of the afternoon. 2 boats tied up, nets drying. One man sitting on a crate mending something, though whether it was the net or the day I couldn't say. He watched us approach with the neutral attention of a man deciding whether to be elsewhere. I had Etienne ask about Sorel. The man said nothing. Then he looked at the water. Then he said Sorrel had been at the dock 4 days before the scheduled signing. Alone and meeting someone. The man on the crate didn't know the other party. Said he'd never seen the man before and hadn't seen him since. Tall, light-skinned, dressed for a city, not an island. They spoke for perhaps 10 minutes on the far end of the dock and then departed in separate directions. Sorrel seemed, in the fisherman's estimation, unsettled afterward. Not frightened, unsettled. There is a distinction. Frightened men run. Unsettled men go quiet and start making decisions. Sorrel, it appeared, had made one. I stood at the end of that dock and looked out at the water and thought about a $2 million deal that happened in full daylight. And a man who walked away from it before it could close, and a white car with tinted glass and 6 hours of patience, and a truck on a mountain road that changed its mind about passing. None of it was subtle, which meant either the people involved were confident or careless. In my experience, in this kind of business, under this kind of sun, those two things are often the same. Etienne drove me back to town by a different route, which I appreciated without asking for an explanation. The sun was lower now, though not by much. On St. Armel, the light doesn't concede gradually. It holds its position all afternoon like a man who refuses to admit the argument is over, and then surrenders all at once around 6. We had maybe 2 hours before that happened. I used the drive to think. Etienne used it to smoke and not ask questions. It was a productive arrangement for both of us. Back at the hotel I'd checked into. A smaller place than the Hotel du Port. Ceiling fan, window overlooking an alley. The kind of room that reminds you why people become detectives instead of tourists. I spread the case documents on the bed and went through them again. Holt's account, Sorrel's business registration. The escrow arrangement which had been drawn up by a firm in Pointe-Pitre that I made a note to look into. The numbers were clean, almost ceremonially clean. That's usually where the dirt is hiding. I called Pam from the hotel telephone. She answered on the second ring the way she always does, as if she'd been expecting it but didn't want to seem eager. I gave her the names I needed checked. Raymond Sorrel, full background, the law firm in Pointe-Pitre. And the warehouse complex on St. Armel, specifically who held the land title before Holtz's company entered negotiations. She read them back to me without writing anything down. She never writes anything down. I've stopped finding it impressive and started finding it mildly intimidating. She told me to be careful again. I told her I'd been careful all day. She asked about the truck on the mountain road, which I had not mentioned. I asked how she knew about the truck on the mountain road. She said Etienne Beaumont had a brother-in-law in Marseille who had a file with an agency she knew someone at. She said this the way other people say it's Tuesday. I sat with the telephone for a moment after she rang off, listening to the ceiling fan and reconsidering my understanding of the word secretary. Dinner that evening was at a small place 2 streets from the dock, where Etienne knew the owner, and the owner knew when not to seat people within earshot of each other. The food was good. The rum was better. Etienne talked about the island the way people talk about a place they love and resent simultaneously, the way you might talk about a relative who keeps borrowing money. He said St. Armel had been quiet for years. Said the Sorrel deal was the biggest transaction the island had seen in a decade, maybe more. That made it worth protecting, I said. Or worth disrupting, Etienne replied. He said it quietly, without theater, which meant he'd been thinking it for a while and had been waiting to see if I'd get there on my own. I had gotten there, but I let him say it anyway. The warehouse site had been contested before Sorrel and Holt came into the picture. A local consortium had been attempting to acquire it for 2 years. The deal fell apart when the landowner died. Old man, no children, title disputed. Then Holt appeared. Then Sorrel brokered the access. Then things moved quickly. The consortium, Etienne explained, was not the kind of group that accepted outcomes gracefully. 3 men, island-connected, with interests in the dock traffic that didn't fully appear on any ledger he'd ever seen. One of them, a man named Courcelle, had reportedly told someone in a bar, 2 weeks before the signing, that the deal would not happen. Not that he hoped it wouldn't, not that he'd try to stop it, that it would not happen. Present tense, the way you state a fact about something already decided. I wrote down Corcel, underlined it. The following morning I went looking for Corcel's operation, which Etienne had described as a boat rental and tour business on the southern end of the harbor. The kind of front that has been a front for so long it may have forgotten it was one. The office was a converted shipping container painted yellow, which I found an interesting aesthetic choice for a business run by a man who'd made a threat in a bar. The young man at the desk said Corcel was not available. I left my name. He didn't write it down either. Apparently nobody on this island wrote things down. Instead of waiting, I walked the harbor. The water was the color it had been from the plane, that color I still hadn't named, something between turquoise and decision. Fishing boats, one ferry, a few private crafts. I was looking at the boats the way you look when you're looking for something, specific and haven't admitted yet what it is. Then I saw it. A white motorboat mid-size tied at the far end of the secondary dock, and on the hull, barely visible beneath a hasty repainting, the ghost of a name that had been there recently, Accord. Accord is the French word for agreement, also for deal. I stood looking at it for longer than was probably wise and thought about Raymond Sorel, who had stood on a different dock 4 days before the signing and spoken with a man from the city for 10 minutes and left unsettled. I thought about a signing that was scheduled in full daylight in a hotel dining room with 2 glasses of mineral water waiting, and I thought about the word Corcel had used in that bar. Not hoped, not planned, would not. Past the boat I noticed a locked storage shed with fresh padlock. My interest, already engaged, sharpened considerably. I didn't touch the shed. Not yet. You learn over time that a locked door is either a wall or an invitation, and the difference depends entirely on how many people are watching. The harbor had the relaxed busyness of a place that notices everything and reports selectively. 2 men were coiling rope near the ferry landing. A boy was selling something from a basket near the seawall. Everyone was approximately minding their own business, which on a small island is indistinguishable from surveillance. I walk back through the harbor slowly, the way a man walks when he wants to appear to have no particular destination, which is different from the way a man walks when he actually has no particular destination, though from the outside they look the same. I was thinking about the boat, the painted-over name, the fresh padlock on a shed that didn't match the general philosophy of maintenance evident elsewhere on that dock. Someone had prepared something, or hidden something, and had done it recently enough that the paint was still slightly uneven in the light. Etienne was waiting outside my hotel when I got back, leaning against the wall with the unhurried patience of a man who has decided the world will get to him eventually. He told me Corcel had sent word, not an invitation exactly, more of a summons dressed in the clothes of an invitation. Corcel would see me at 4 o'clock at a place called the Lemon Bar, which was neither on the water nor particularly close to anything, and which Etienne described as neutral territory, in a tone that suggested the neutrality had been negotiated. It was 11 in the morning. I had 5 hours to fill. I spent 2 of them at the local records office, a single room attached to the municipal building that smelled of mildew and administrative resignation. The clerk was a woman of late middle age who regarded outside inquiries with the particular skepticism of someone who has seen outside inquiries cause nothing but paperwork. I asked about the land title for the warehouse property. She located the file after 20 minutes and placed it on the counter and watched me read it as if the information might escape if she looked away. The history was exactly as complicated as I'd expected, and in precisely the ways I hadn't anticipated. The land had been in a single family for 3 generations. The last title holder, one Armand Delacombe, had died 14 months prior. No will. 3 distant relatives with competing claims, none of them resident on the island. The title had entered a legal suspension that would have taken years to resolve through ordinary channels. Then, 8 months ago, All three relatives had signed a joint transfer to a holding company registered in Guadeloupe simultaneously, on the same day. Three people on three different islands signing the same document on the same day, none of them lawyers, for a property they had been disputing for over a year. I've seen coincidences before. They're usually smaller and less expensive. I wrote down the name of the holding company, Solaris Adgestion. Then I wrote down the date of the transfer and the name of the notary who'd certified it. Then I sat back and looked at what I'd written and thought about Raymond Sorel, who had somehow brokered Gerald Holt's access to a property whose title had been resolved, conveniently and suddenly 8 months ago. I used the remaining time before 4 o'clock to walk the neighborhood around the warehouse site itself. It was a 20-minute walk from the center of town, past the point where the streets stopped pretending to have names. The site was larger than I'd pictured from the documents. 4 structures, partially built, on land that sloped gently toward a secondary channel of the harbor, deep enough for mid-size cargo vessels, I noted. Not the tourist dock, not the fishing dock, a third entrance to the island that the main harbor maps didn't emphasize. A third entrance to the island that nobody emphasized. I stood at the fence line and looked at the unfinished walls and the heavy equipment, parked at angles that suggested interrupted work, and I thought about what $2 million buys on a Caribbean island with a discreet Chena and L and limited official interest in the details of inbound cargo. It buys quite a lot, was the answer I arrived at. The deal under the sun was looking less like a real estate transaction and more like a piece of infrastructure. Infrastructure for something that preferred not to be named. The Lemon Bar was a concrete room with 4 tables, a bar, and a ceiling fan that moved the heat around without reducing it, which I suppose is the best you can ask of a ceiling fan. Corsell was already there when I arrived at 4, which meant he'd been there earlier, watching the entrance. He was a large man, somewhere in his 50s, with the physical ease of someone who had spent decades being the largest person in whatever room he occupied. He had a glass of something clear in front of him and no expression in particular. I sat down. He looked at me the way men like Corsell look at men like me, measuring the distance between what I was and what I might become if the conversation went a certain direction. I've been looked at that way enough times to find it more tedious than threatening, though I try not to let that show prematurely. He said, in accented English that was better than he wanted me to know, that I was asking questions about matters that had already been resolved. I said I was asking questions about a missing man. He said those were the same thing. He said it without blinking. The ceiling fan made its rounds. The bartender found something requiring his attention at the far end of the counter. Corsell drank from his glass without hurrying, and set it down with the deliberateness of a man who controls the pace of things and wants you to know it. I told him that resolved was an interesting word for a man who'd disappeared the morning of a $2 million signing. He said Sorel had made a choice. I asked what kind of choice looks like vanishing without a word to anyone. He said the smart kind. He wasn't threatening me, that was the interesting part. A man like Corsell, in a room like this, with the conversation going where it was going, would typically apply some pressure at this point. Instead, he was almost conversational, almost helpful in the way that a closed door is helpful. It tells you clearly that you're not getting through it. He told me Gerald Holt was not what he appeared. He told me the deal had never been what Holt had described it as. He told me Sorel had understood that eventually, and had acted accordingly. Then he stood up, left money on the table for both our drinks, and walked out into the afternoon without looking back. I sat with my untouched glass and the ceiling fan and the bartender's studied indifference, and thought about the architecture of what I'd just been told. Corsell had not denied involvement. He had not confirmed it either. What he'd done was redirect, point me at Holt and away from Sorel's location, which was either genuine misdirection or genuine information. In my experience, the most effective misdirection usually contains something true. I called Pam from a telephone at the bar. She had results. Solaris Gestion, the holding company that had acquired the warehouse land, was registered to a nominee director in Guadeloupe, which was expected, but the beneficial ownership trail, when followed with the persistence she apparently applied to everything, led to a shell company in Panama that shared a registered agent with 2 other companies. One of those companies had been fined by American customs authorities 18 months ago for misdeclared cargo arriving from the Caribbean. The other was a subsidiary of Gerald Holt's import business. I stood with the telephone pressed to my ear and let that arrange itself into something with a shape. Holt had not arrived on St. Armel to buy a warehouse. He had arrived to complete the acquisition of infrastructure he had already partially funded through a chain of companies careful enough to seem unrelated. The $2 million deal was the final visible layer of something that had been constructed over years, in increments just below the level of official attention. Sorrel had brokered it all, and then, 4 days before the signing, something had changed his mind. Pam said one more thing before ringing off. Raymond Sorrel had, 5 years prior, cooperated with a French customs investigation into Caribbean cargo irregularities. The cooperation had been quiet. The case had been closed without public resolution, and Sorrel had apparently resumed normal operations. But cooperation leaves traces, she said, the kind that surface when someone decides to go looking. I asked who might have gone looking recently. She said she didn't know yet. She said yet the way she says most things, as a statement of temporary conditions. I went back to the harbor that evening as the light finally made its concession and the sky turned the colors it apparently kept in reserve all day. The secondary dock was quieter. The boy with the basket was gone. The 2 men with the rope were gone. I walked to the far end where the white motorboat was tied and stood looking at the storage shed with the fresh padlock. The harbor made its nighttime sounds, water against hull, rope against cleat, the particular silence of a place that has stopped pretending to be only what it appears. The padlock was good, but the hasp it was attached to was not. 2 screws into wood that had been absorbing salt air for years. I had the shed open in under a minute, which either speaks well of my abilities or poorly of the installation, and I prefer not to decide which. Inside, 3 wooden crates, unmarked. Diving equipment, good quality. 2 outboard motors still in manufacturer packaging. And against the back wall, a canvas bag containing a change of clothes, a French passport, and an amount of cash in mixed currencies that suggested a man who had prepared to leave quickly and quietly and alone. The passport belonged to Raymond Sorrel. The photograph was recent. The passport itself was not. It had been issued 4 years ago and showed considerable use. Stamps from Martinique, Guadeloupe, Paris, twice from Miami. But here it was, in a shed on a dock he'd visited 4 days before his disappearance, along with enough cash to go somewhere and enough clothes to start over when he got there. He hadn't used it. Either he'd been prevented or he'd changed his plan. Neither option pointed somewhere reassuring. I put everything back as I found it and replaced the hasp as best I could and walked away from the dock at a pace that communicated nothing in particular. The shed told me Sorrel had planned to run. The dock at Anse Marigot told me something had shifted after the meeting with the city man. The land records told me the deal was built on years of patient construction. And Corsel's careful non-answers told me Sorrel was alive, or had been very recently, and that someone wanted me looking at Holt instead of at wherever Sorrel actually was. I slept badly, which on this case felt appropriate. The ceiling fan stirred the night air into something resembling a breeze, and I lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, and arranged the pieces into different configurations, the way you do when you have enough information to be confused, but not quite enough to be certain. Holt had built the infrastructure. Sorrel had brokered the access. Someone had visited Sorrel at a remote dock 4 days before the signing, and Sorrel had left a bag he never came back for. The morning came in hot and indifferent as advertised. Breakfast was coffee and something fried that Etienne had recommended and whose name I didn't catch and whose composition I decided not to investigate. We sat at a table outside a small place near the market, and I told him what I'd found in the shed. He listened without interrupting, which in my experience is the mark of someone who is either very patient or already knows most of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said that the dock at the southern harbor had a nighttime visitor 2 days ago. A boat running without lights, in and out in under an hour. He knew this because the boy who sold things from the basket near the seawall also sold information, and did so with the entrepreneurial enthusiasm of the very young and the very observant. The boat had come from the direction of the outer channel, the same channel that ran behind the warehouse site, the one not emphasized on harbor maps. It had tied briefly at the secondary dock where the white motorboat and the storage shed were, and a single figure had gone ashore and returned within 20 minutes, after which the boat departed the way it had come, quietly and without incident. Someone had accessed that shed 2 nights ago, which meant either they'd retrieved something, or checked that it was still there, or left something new. I didn't like any of those options with equal measure, though, for different reasons. I paid for breakfast and went back to the secondary dock in the full morning light, which felt less conspicuous than the previous evening, and probably wasn't. The shed hasp was exactly as I'd left it, which was a small comfort until I opened the door and found the canvas bag had been moved. Not taken, moved 6 inches to the left, enough to be noticed by someone who'd looked carefully the first time. Someone knew I'd been there, and rather than remove the bag or replace the lock, they'd left it slightly wrong, like a message written in the language of minor displacements. I have received clearer messages and less interesting ones. I stood in the shed doorway and thought about what kind of person sends that particular message. Not a warning, not a threat, something more like acknowledgement. You are here. We know. We haven't decided what to do about it yet. That last part was either reassuring or the opposite, depending on how the decision eventually came out. I decided it was time to have a direct conversation with Gerald Holt. He was staying at the Hotel du Port, the one with the colonial balconies and the untouched glasses of mineral water, which struck me as either brazen or oblivious, and I was no longer certain which. He received me in the dining room over coffee, composed and unhurried in the manner of a man who has calculated that composure is his best available instrument. He asked if I'd found Sorel. I said, not yet. He asked what I had found. I said enough to have some questions. I asked about Solaris's gestion. The name landed on him the way a stone lands on still water, a brief disturbance, quickly smoothed. He said it was a holding vehicle, common in regional transactions. I said it was connected to a company find for misdeclared Caribbean cargo 18 months ago. He said that connection was indirect and the fine had been administrative. I said his subsidiary's name was on the registered agent documents. He said subsidiaries were complex. He said it with the patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone he has decided to find tiresome. Then I asked about the man who had met Sorella at Innsmaragon 4 days before the signing. The composure held, but something behind it shifted, the way a well-maintained facade shifts when the foundation underneath it makes a small adjustment. Holt said he didn't know what I was referring to. I described the man, tall, light-skinned, city clothes, not from the island. Holt said there were many men matching that description with legitimate reasons to meet business associates. I said Sorel had seemed unsettled afterward. Holt said Sorel was a nervous man by nature. He was lying, which I had expected, and he was doing it well, which I had also expected, and neither fact advanced my position. What I had were connections and patterns and a shed with a moved bag, none of which constituted the kind of evidence that requires anyone to do anything. Holt had paid me to find Sorel. The more I looked, the more I suspected that finding Sorel might not serve Holt's interests, as neatly as he'd implied when he sat across from me in my office and told me about a missing partner and an interrupted deal. I left Holt to his coffee and his composure and walked out into the sun, which continued its policy of total commitment. I needed to find Sorel before someone else's timeline on this island reached its conclusion. The bag in the shed suggested Sorel had a plan. The nighttime boat suggested someone was monitoring that plan. Courcelle had pointed me at Holt. Holt had deflected toward abstractions. And somewhere in the triangle formed by those 3 points was a man with a packed bag and a history of cooperating with French, customs, and a very good reason to have chosen a specific Tuesday morning to disappear. Etienne had a cousin who had a friend who knew a fisherman who worked the outer channel on irregular schedules, which on St. Armel passed for a lead. The island operated on a network of connections so thoroughly interwoven that asking one person a question was essentially asking everyone, with the delay measured in hours rather than days. I had come to appreciate this system. It was slower than a telephone directory and considerably more reliable. By midday, Etienne had arranged a meeting at a rum shop near the market that smelled of cane sugar and accumulated afternoons. The fisherman's name was Theodore. He was old in the way that men who work the water get old, weathered past the point where age becomes the most interesting thing about them. He drank slowly and spoke in a mixture of Creole and French that Etienne translated in summary rather than detail, which I suspected meant certain things were being editorially softened. Theodore had seen activity at the outer channel 3 nights ago. Not a boat this time, a light, steady, not signaling. The kind of light a man uses when he's waiting in a fixed position and isn't trying to be invisible to everyone, just to most people. The light had come from the direction of a small uninhabited promontory east of the warehouse site, a rocky outcrop locals called Point Sèche, dry point, because nothing grew there, and the rock retained heat until well after midnight. No fresh water. No shelter worth mentioning. The kind of place you go when you want to be where no one would think to look, or when someone else has decided that's where you'll be. The distinction matters, and Theodore's account didn't clarify it. I thanked him, and paid for his rum, and 2 more he hadn't asked for yet, but would. I needed to reach Pointe without announcing the intention, which ruled out asking Etienne to drive me to within walking distance, and ruled out hiring any of the visible boats at the main harbor. I was working through the logistics of this when the second tension of the trip arrived, as these things tend to without scheduling. I was walking back from the rum shop through a narrow street behind the market when I became aware of footsteps behind me that were maintaining a consistent interval, not gaining, not dropping back, just present, the way a shadow is present. I turned left at the next corner and stopped in a doorway. 30 seconds later, a man came around the corner and stopped when he saw me waiting. He was young, perhaps 25, in a light shirt with the collar damp from the heat. He looked at me with the expression of someone whose plan had not included this particular development. I asked him in English who he was following me for. He switched to French. I switched back. We continued this for a moment, which was neither productive nor entirely without entertainment value. Eventually, with the resigned cooperation of a man who has realized his options have narrowed considerably, he told me his name was Marcel, and that he worked for Courcelle. He had not been instructed to follow me, he clarified, but to watch me. He said this as if the distinction mattered. I told him it didn't. He said Courcelle wanted to know if I'd been to the shed at the secondary dock. I said I'd been in the vicinity. He nodded as if this confirmed something. Then he told me, with the air of a man delivering a message he didn't fully understand, that Courcelle said to look at the water, not the land. Look at the water, not the land. I let Marcel go, and stood in the narrow street and held that instruction at arm's length and examined it. Courcelle had redirected me at Holt. Now he was redirecting me toward the water. Either he was walking me in careful increments toward something he wanted found but couldn't find himself, or he was walking me away from something he wanted protected. Both interpretations required him to know more about Sorel's whereabouts than he'd admitted in the Lemon Bar. I filed Marcel's message next to everything else and went to find Etienne. Etienne knew a man with a small boat and flexible principles, which was the precise combination I needed. By 4 in the afternoon, I was on the water. moving along the eastern coastline in a vessel that was seaworthy, in the way that certain arguments are convincing, technically, under limited scrutiny. Etienne had stayed ashore at my request, which he accepted without complaint, and which probably meant he was making telephone calls I would have preferred he didn't make. The coastline was steep and green above the waterline and pale rock below it, and the outer channel ran smooth and flat in the late heat. Pointe Sèche appeared as Tudor had described it, a bare rocky outcrop jutting into the channel, low and pale, without vegetation or obvious shelter. From the water it looked empty. I had the boatman hold back while I looked through a set of field glasses I'd had the foresight to bring, and the good fortune not to have needed until now. The rock was unoccupied to all visible surfaces, but at the base of the promontory, where the rock met the water on the landward side, there was a narrow ledge not visible from either shore, and on the ledge, pulled partially above the waterline, a small dinghy. The boatmen brought us in as close as the channel depth allowed, and I went the rest of the way by a method I will describe, only as undignified, and which involved more contact with Caribbean seawater than I had planned for when packing. I climbed onto the ledge and found what I had been moving toward for 3 days, assembled at last into a single location. The dinghy, a waterproof case containing food, water, and medication, a shortwave radio powered down, and Raymond Sorel sitting with his back against the rock face, watching me arrive with the expression of a man who has been expecting company and hoping it would be the right kind. He looked worse than his passport photograph and better than a man who had been hiding on a rock ledge for 4 days had any right to. Lean, unshaven, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent extended time alone with a decision they're not entirely at peace with. He looked at me for a long moment before he spoke, sizing up the distance between what I was and what I might represent. I told him my name, told him Holt had hired me to find him. He said he knew. He said it without surprise, which meant he'd been expecting Holt to send someone. He just hadn't known who. I sat down on the ledge with the water moving below us and the late sun cutting hard across the channel, and I told him I wasn't there to deliver him to anyone. That I was there because a man had paid me to find him, and I had found him. And what happened next was a conversation rather than a transaction. He studied that for a moment, then he talked. Once men like Sorel start talking, they tend to keep going, because the weight of what they're carrying has been compressing for days, and the relief of releasing it overrides the instinct for caution. The deal had never been what Holt presented. The warehouse complex was infrastructure for a cargo operation that moved goods through the outer channel without formal inspection, using the island's limited customs presence as a structural advantage rather than an obstacle to be avoided. Sorel had known this from the beginning. He had built the land access, neutralized the title dispute, and positioned himself as the essential broker. He had done it for money, and done it willingly, and he did not appear to be asking for absolution on that point. What he was asking me to understand was what had changed 4 days before the signing. The man at Anse Maragon had been French customs, not an investigator, a coordinator, someone who had been monitoring the construction of Holt's operation for 14 months, and had chosen that particular moment, 4 days before the final transaction closed, to make contact with the one person in the arrangement who had a prior history of cooperation. The meeting had lasted 10 minutes. The message had been simple: sign the deal and become permanently complicit in an operation that Customs was prepared to prosecute. Or walk away now and the prior cooperation record would provide a degree of insulation. Sorel had walked away. Not to the authorities, not yet. First to the shed at the secondary dock where he had assembled his exit materials over the previous weeks. Then to Pointe Sèche, which he had identified months earlier as a position from which he could reach open water quickly if necessary. He had been waiting on that ledge for 4 days, monitoring his shortwave for word on whether Holt had proceeded, folded, or done something more direct about the problem of a disappeared broker who knew everything. The fact that Holt had sent a private detective rather than the alternative was, Sorrell said, mildly encouraging. I asked about Corsell. Sorrell's expression shifted in a way that contained something close to respect. Corsell had known about the customs contact. Corsell had been working adjacent to the French investigation without formally being part of it. Using his own interests in the warehouse site, the consortium's failed acquisition, as cover for a longer arrangement with the investigators. He had not arranged Sorrell's disappearance. He had simply made it easier, cleared a path as it were, pointed the right people away from Poinsèche, and eventually pointed me toward the water. The picture assembled itself with the unpleasant clarity of things that have been true for a while before you see them. Holt had spent years building something. Sorrell had helped build it and then been handed a reason to stop. Corsell had been maneuvering against Holt's operation while appearing merely territorial, and the French customs coordinator had used the week before a $2 million signing to flip the one essential broker, at the precise moment when flipping him would cause maximum disruption with minimum official exposure. It was, I had to admit, elegant work. Expensive and patient and elegantly done. I asked Sorrell what he wanted. He said he wanted to disappear properly, with enough distance between himself and St. Armel that what came next, and something was coming next. The investigation, the exposure, the unraveling of Holt's carefully layered construction would reach him only as news, not as consequence. He was not asking me to help him. He was explaining himself. There is a difference, and he seemed to understand it clearly, which raised him slightly in my estimation and didn't solve any of my immediate problems. My immediate problems were these. I had been paid by Holt to find Sorrell. I had found Sorrell. Delivering that information to Holt would complete my professional obligation and almost certainly end Sorrell's window of escape, and possibly his more general continuity, in ways I didn't need to enumerate out loud. Not delivering it meant returning Holt's money and explaining nothing, which was cleaner morally and considerably more complicated practically. I sat on that rock ledge in the Caribbean sun and thought about what kind of detective I was. The water below us had no opinion on the subject. Sorrell watched me think. He had the patience of a man who has already made his own decisions and is now waiting to learn whether someone else's will align with them. He didn't appeal to me, didn't offer money, didn't produce an argument, just waited, which was either respectful or strategic, and probably both. I thought about Pam, who had booked this flight because she thought a February case in the Caribbean sounded like a good idea, and who would have a precise and well-informed opinion on what I was about to decide, which she would deliver without being asked, and without softening it for my comfort. I told Sorrell I needed an hour. He said he had been on that ledge for 4 days, and an hour was something he could manage. I climbed back into the water with the same absence of dignity as before, and returned to the boat, and had the boatman take me back along the coastline while I sat in the stern and watched St. Armel recede, and thought about Gerald Holt in his dining room with his untouched coffee and his careful deflections and his $2 million in escrow waiting for a signature that was not going to come. I thought about what he'd actually hired me to do. He'd hired me to find Sorrell, that was the stated objective. But stated objectives in my line of work are often the presentable version of something less presentable underneath. Holt needed to know where Sorrell was. Why a man needs to know where a disappeared business partner is hiding can be answered several ways, and the charitable interpretation had been losing ground steadily since I'd found the connection between Solaris Gestion and the Miss Dicklard cargo fine. The uncharitable interpretation had been gaining ground at approximately the same rate. I was arriving at a destination I hadn't booked. I called Pam from the boatman's radio, which was an instrument of uncertain vintage and remarkable resilience. The connection was poor enough that her voice came through in fragments, but Pam communicates efficiently under suboptimal conditions, which is one of many things I rely on without adequately acknowledging. She told me 2 things. First, The French customs investigation into Holt's operation had been formally elevated that morning, which meant it had crossed from monitoring into active prosecution. Second, Gerald Holt had booked a flight off St. Armel, departing at 7 the following morning. Holte was leaving, not because the deal had collapsed, because the investigation had moved and he knew it had moved, which meant he had sources inside the process, which meant the window between now and 7 tomorrow morning was the only window that existed for anything that needed to happen before jurisdictional complications made it academic. I asked Pam what she thought I should do. There was a pause that contained, I estimated, about 4 different assessments of the situation delivered simultaneously at a frequency only she and I could detect. Then she said, "Do what you'd tell someone else to do." I thought about that for the rest of the boat ride back. It's useful advice, that kind. Removes the personal arithmetic. What would I tell someone else in this situation? I would tell them that they were hired to find a man, and they found him, and their obligation to the client ends there. I would tell them that what the client does with that information is not their responsibility. And then I would tell them, quietly, that responsibility is a flexible concept, and its edges are determined by what you're willing to live with afterward, which is a different calculation entirely. Etienne was at the dock when we returned, as I had suspected he would be. He looked at me with the expression he used when he already knew something and was waiting to see if I'd figured it out independently. I had. I asked him directly whether Courcelle knew about the French customs escalation. Etienne said Courcelle had been informed that morning. I asked whether Courcelle had a way to move someone off the island quietly and quickly, avoiding the main harbor and the airport. Etienne considered the question with the care it deserved and said that was a thing that could be arranged. Before sunrise, if necessary. The third and final tension of the trip arrived at approximately 8 that evening, which was later than I'd expected, and more direct than I'd hoped for. I was in my hotel room assembling the pieces of what would happen next when the door opened without a knock, completing a symmetry with the way Voss had once entered my office that I found more ironic than comforting. 2 men, neither of them Courcelle, neither of them young, both of them with the professional composure of people who had been sent to retrieve something specific and weren't particularly interested in conversation. They wanted to know where Sorel was. They didn't say who had sent them, which in itself was information. Holt's name was nowhere in the room, but it occupied most of the available space. I told them I hadn't located Sorel, which was technically accurate in the sense that I hadn't located him in the last 6 hours, and which satisfied no one, including me. The larger of the two moved toward me with the unhurried confidence of a man who has been told that discomfort produces results. He was correct about that in general, and incorrect about this specific instance. What followed was brief and unpleasant, and settled in my favor by a margin I would describe as adequate rather than comfortable. The room was small, which helped. The ceiling fan was not a factor. When it was over, I was standing, and they were making the kinds of sounds men make when they're deciding whether to reconsider their professional choices. I suggested they reconsider. They appeared to take the suggestion seriously. I straightened my jacket, which had suffered, and picked up the telephone and called Etienne and told him the timeline had moved up, and that before sunrise meant as close to now as possible. I went back to Pointe-Sèche by a different route in a different boat, without the boatman from the afternoon, and arrived at the ledge in the last of the evening light to find Sorel exactly where I'd left him, which was either patience or resignation, and had probably been both at various points over 4 days. I told him there was a boat coming. I told him where it would take him and who had arranged it and what it would cost him, which was the cooperation he'd been holding back, the full account formally for the French investigation. He nodded as if he'd known this was the price. He probably had. We waited on the ledge together while the last light left the sky and the channel went dark, and the stars came out with the sudden completeness they manage in places far from city glow. Sorrel was quiet in the way men get quiet when something long held is almost over. Not relieved exactly. More like a man who has been carrying a specific weight for so long that the anticipation of setting it down has become its own kind of burden. I understood the feeling well enough not to comment on it. We sat with the water below us and said very little, and it was sufficient. I thought about Gerald Holt in his room at the Hotel Duport, packed and ready for a 7 o'clock departure. Believing the men he'd sent to my room had either retrieved the information he needed, or sufficiently discouraged further interference. He would be sleeping the careful sleep of a man who has contingencies for his contingencies. He had not, I suspected, put a private detective from a rainy city in his list of variables requiring serious attention. That was a miscalculation of the kind that tends to have a long tail. The boat arrived at 40 minutes past 9, small, dark-hulled, running with minimal lights in a manner that suggested familiarity with the outer channel and its particular relationship with official visibility. 2 men aboard, neither of them anyone I recognized, both of them operating with the brisk efficiency of people who have a schedule and no interest in sentiment. Sorrel stood up and looked at me for a moment with an expression that contained more than I had time to catalog. Then he climbed into the boat, and the night took him, and the channel took the boat, and that was the end of Raymond. Sorrel on St. Armel. I made my way back to shore and walked to Corsel's establishment, the yellow shipping container at the southern harbor, which was open and lit at this hour in the manner of a place that keeps its own schedule. Corsel was inside alone with a glass and a ledger he closed when I entered. I told him Sorrel was moving. He said he knew. I said Holt was leaving at 7. He said he knew that too. I asked what would happen to Holt's operation once Sorrel's formal cooperation reached the investigators. Corsel looked at his glass and said slowly and completely. He seemed satisfied with the prospect. I asked him why he had bothered helping me find Sorrel at all. He could have managed the whole arrangement with a private detective from the mainland, complicating the logistics and getting into altercations in his hotel room. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that an outside party finding Sorrel was cleaner than a local one. It kept his own name at a useful distance from the official sequence of events. He had used me as a visible line of inquiry while the real movement happened through channels I hadn't been meant to see until I'd already served my purpose. He said this without apology. I found that honest. I had been, in other words, a distraction with legs, a moving object that drew attention and created noise while the actual operation unfolded quietly around me. I had found Sorrel, yes. But Sorrel had been findable because Corsel had arranged for him to be findable, at the right moment, by the right person, to produce the right outcome. The whole thing had been choreographed with a patience and precision that I could appreciate professionally while finding it personally irritating. Corsel offered me a drink. I accepted it because some responses to being outmaneuvered are better made with something in hand. I spent what remained of the night writing up my account of the case in the hotel room, which now had a broken door hinge and a chair that had not survived the earlier altercation, with its dignity intact. I wrote what I had found and what it meant and what I had done and what I had chosen not to do, which was deliver Sorrel's location to the man who had hired me. In the morning I would return Holt's money, all of it, including the expenses. The money had a smell I hadn't liked since Pam first handed me the file, and I'd put it behind the radiator. At 6 in the morning I went to the Hotel Duport. The dining room was empty at that hour, except for a single staff member arranging chairs. I asked for Holt's room number and was declined, which was correct procedure, and then I left an envelope at the front desk containing the cash and a note that said found him. He found something too. In my experience, those tend to cancel each other out. I was not certain Holt would understand the note. I was reasonably certain it would concern him, which was the closest I could get to a professional opinion under the circumstances. My flight left at noon. Etienne drove me to the small airport through the morning heat, which had resumed its policy of total commitment without reference to anyone's plans or comfort. He didn't ask about Sorel, and I didn't offer. He asked if I would come back to St. Armel. I said probably not. He nodded as if this was the expected answer. We shook hands at the terminal entrance, and he drove away in the car that ran on optimism, and I went inside and sat, with my bag and my notes. And the particular tiredness of a case that had ended correctly and not well, which is a combination I have learned to accept as a category of its own. The island disappeared below the plane in the way small things disappear when you gain altitude, not all at once, but in stages. Each stage revealing a larger frame until the thing itself is just a detail in a wider picture. The outer channel was visible from the air, and the warehouse site, and the secondary dock, and Puente Sèche. From up here, the whole arrangement was legible in a way it hadn't been from inside it. You could see how the pieces fit, how the channel connected to the site, connected to the dock, connected to the rock, where a man had sat for 4 days making a decision he'd already made. The flight back had a stopover in Puente Peta, which gave me an hour in a small airport terminal with plastic seats and a coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration. I drank it anyway. I had the case notes on my knee, and I went through them not because I needed to, but because I've learned that the hour after a case ends is when you see the things you missed while you were inside it. The things that were true all along and only become obvious once you've stopped needing them to be otherwise. What I had missed, or rather what I had seen and not fully weighted, was how early everything had been set in motion. The land title transfer 8 months before the signing. The customs monitoring 14 months before the signing. Corsel's consortium positioning itself 2 years before the signing. All of it predating Holt's visible arrival on St. Armel by margins that turned his confident 2-piece suit into a costume worn for an audience that had already read the script. Holt had thought he was running the operation. He had been the operation. That was the part that sat with me through the second flight over the Gulf, back toward gray skies and familiar rain. Holt had invested years and considerable money into building something that had been monitored from its foundation, with its essential broker flipped at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability, and its entire visible structure left intact long enough to constitute evidence rather than suspicion. The French Customs Service had not disrupted Holt's operation. They had let him build it, documented every layer, and then removed the keystone 4 days before it closed. Patient work, cold work, effective work. I thought about Sorel on that rock ledge, the packed bag, the shortwave radio, the medication I hadn't asked about. A man who had helped build something he knew was wrong and had found, at the last available moment, a door that opened in a direction other than the one he'd been walking. Whether he'd taken it out of conscience or self-preservation was a question. I'd turned over several times and arrived at the same answer each time. Probably both, in proportion sets shifted depending on what hour you asked him. People are rarely one thing. It's inconvenient but consistent. Pam was at the office when I got back, which was not surprising, and the office had been tidied in a way that suggested she had been there for some time and had used the waiting productively, which was also not surprising. She looked at me with the comprehensive assessment she applies to my returns from cases involving physical altercations, which apparently I wear visibly despite my best efforts at presentation. She said, "The door hinge." I said, "How do you know about the door hinge?" She said, "You always lead slightly to the left when something's happened to your right side." I sat down and said nothing to that because there was nothing useful to say. She had prepared a summary of the post-case developments, which she placed on the desk with the quiet efficiency of someone delivering a verdict they've been holding while the defendant traveled. Gerald Holt had not, as it turned out, departed St. Armel on his 7 o'clock flight. He had been met at the airport by 2 officers from the French customs investigation, who had been waiting with the particular patience of people who had been planning the meeting for considerably longer than Holt had been planning his departure. His escrow funds had been frozen as of that morning. His subsidiary companies were under examination. The warehouse site on St. Armel had been formally seized pending investigation. The holding company Solaris Gestion had been dissolved by its nominee director, who had apparently made that decision at remarkable speed once the investigation became public. Which is the thing about nominee directors, their loyalty is administrative, rather than personal, and dissolves at approximately the same rate as their liability exposure. The three relatives who had signed the joint land transfer on the same day from 3 different islands had each, separately, received visits from investigators asking how that had come to happen. I asked Pam about Sorrel. She said there was no public information about his whereabouts, which was consistent with a formal cooperation arrangement that hadn't yet surfaced in official statements. She said this carefully, in the way she says things when she knows more than she's saying and is deciding how much of the rest serves any useful purpose. I told her Sorrel had been on a rock in the Caribbean for 4 days, and had made a decision that probably cost him more than he'd initially calculated, and less than the alternative would have. She considered this. She said that sounded like most decisions. I returned Holt's money in full, which I had already done symbolically with the envelope at the hotel desk, and formally through a transfer Pam processed with the brisk precision she applies to all financial matters. The case was closed without having been completed in the way the client had intended, which placed it in a category of its own in my filing system, a category I had labeled miscellaneous, and which had, over the years, accumulated more files than any other. The miscellaneous drawer was, in a sense, the most honest record of my career. It contained all the cases that ended correctly. Pam made coffee, and we sat with it in the office while the rain came back against the windows, in the familiar way it has of arriving without announcement and staying without apology. She asked if I'd eaten anything since the airport. I said I'd had coffee in Puente Piota. She said that didn't count. I said it had been a philosophical experience, if not a nutritional one. She gave me the look she reserves for statements she finds technically accurate and practically useless, which is a look I have become familiar with, and have not, despite significant opportunity, learned to avoid provoking. I thought about calling Corsell to ask if Sorrel made it. I didn't. Some questions are better left as speculation. The answer wouldn't change anything. Caring isn't the same as needing to know. It's just the tax you pay for staying in this work long enough to see patterns. The patterns were clear. Sorrel would either make it or he wouldn't. Both outcomes had been accounted for. The rain stopped around midnight. I sat with the lights off and the window open, listening to the city's exhale. The Caribbean felt distant already. The heat, the rock ledge, the yellow shipping container, the ceiling fan that moved heat around without reducing it. All of it folding into memory. What remained was the case file and the returned check, and a Thursday night in a city that had no idea what happened east of Guadeloupe. Pam left at her usual time, which wasn't the clock, but when she'd finished what she considered essential. She paused at the door and said something I didn't catch. I asked her to repeat it. She said, "Next time someone offers you a February case, take it, but maybe choose a different island." I said I'd consider it. She said she knew I wouldn't. She was right. The office felt larger after she left. I poured the last of the bourbon. "My name is Jack Orton. I've been a private detective in this city for 9 years. The Caribbean case didn't end the way anyone expected, which is the only way cases ever end. Holt's operation is in pieces. Sorrel is somewhere else, probably under a name he didn't borrow. Corsell is still on his island. And I'm still here, with this window and this rain." And the silence that follows, a case that resolved correctly and left a taste I couldn't name. The sun came up. It always does. The city stretched and started its day without consulting me. The file went into the miscellaneous drawer. I closed it and sat down and waited for the next client, the next story. The next set of questions without easy answers. That's the job. Not solving mysteries. Just staying in the room long enough to see how they turn out. The rain returns. The ceiling fan turns. That'll have to be enough.